The first man who came to steal Naomi Alder's old mule believed he'd found the easiest victim in the San Luis Valley. 5 days later, he would ride away leaving the mule behind, surrendering the life he'd always known, and telling everyone who would listen about a strange hillside cabin that stayed warm while stronger homes froze. Long before anyone called it brilliant, neighbors mocked the earth-covered house as a widow's foolish experiment. But on a cold October afternoon, as the wind carried the smell of coming snow down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, Naomi stood in her yard with a wooden yoke across her shoulders and watched an armed rider approach, already certain of how the day would end. His name, she would learn later, was Cassian Roe. He rode a bay gelding lathered along the neck, and he carried a Spencer carbine across his lap the way a working man carries a shovel. He was not the first outlaw to ride through that country. The San Luis Valley had been thick with them since the war, men who had drifted west after Missouri went dark and had never found a reason to stop drifting. Naomi had prepared for men like him the same way she had prepared for wolves and drought and the coming winter. She had prepared by building something no one understood. Her cabin sat at the base of a low ridge, half tucked into the hillside like a badger's set. The north wall was earth. The roof was earth. The south wall faced the sun and was pierced by 3 small square windows glazed with wagon grease paper. Beside the cabin stood a lean-to of split cottonwood, and beyond the lean-to, wandering in a fenced patch of stubble, was a single gray mule. The mule's name was Fen. She was 14 hands, sway-backed, and older than Naomi's oldest child. She had 1 white sock and 1 ear that flopped forward when she was thinking. Every neighbor who had ever seen her had said the same thing. That mule is done. That mule won't pull another season. That mule ought to be a hide on a wall. Naomi had refused 3 offers to trade her. She had refused 2 offers to buy her. She had once refused a bag of silver coin in exchange for Fen and a plow, and the man who had offered it had ridden off calling her a fool loud enough for the children to hear. Cassian Roe reined in 10 yards from the door. He looked at the sod roof. He looked at the earth wall. He looked at the mule. He did not look at Naomi at first, and that told her more about him than any word could have. "Mom," he said finally, "I'll be needing supper and a place to sleep out of the wind. I'll be needing that mule in the morning." Naomi set the yoke down and straightened her back. Her 3 children were inside the cabin. She could hear the youngest, Ephraim, singing a low, tuneless song to himself the way he did when he was afraid and pretending not to be. "Take the mule," she said. "Leave my children alone." He looked at her then. His eyes were the pale color of river ice. "I didn't say anything about your children. You didn't have to." He almost smiled. He swung down from the bay and tied it to the hitching post, and he told her he would sleep in the lean-to and be gone before first light with the mule. He told her the bay was blown. He told her he needed a fresh mount, and a mule that could climb was worth 2 horses in the country he was headed into. He told her all of this in the flat voice of a man reading a bill of sale. Then he stopped and squinted at the cabin. "What in God's name did you build here?" She did not answer him. She picked up her yoke and carried the water to the door and went inside and closed it behind her. The 3 children were sitting on the raised sleeping platform along the south wall. Sable, who was 9, had her arm around Ephraim, who was 5. Between them sat Wren, who was 7 and had her father's steady eyes. Naomi set the buckets down and knelt in front of them and spoke very quietly. "There is a man outside. He is going to sleep in the lean-to tonight. He is going to take Fen in the morning. He is not going to come inside this cabin. Do you understand me?" Sable nodded once. Wren did not move. Ephraim asked, in the small voice of a child who had already learned not to ask twice, whether the man was going to hurt them. "No," Naomi said. "He is going to take the mule and he is going to leave. And we are going to be all right." She said it because she needed to hear it herself. She had built the cabin with her own hands and the help of an old Ute man named Peter Standing Bear, who had watched her husband die of the fever and had stayed on through that first terrible spring to teach her things her husband had never known. Peter had taught her about the ridge. He had taught her about the earth. He had taught her about the mule. But there was one thing Peter had taught her that she had not yet told anyone, not even her children, and it had to do with what was under the floor of the cabin, and with what Fen would do if the wrong person tried to lead her away in the dark. Naomi did not tell the children this. She fed them cornbread and salt pork and a little of the last summer's dried plums, and she sent them to the platform to sleep. Then she sat by the fire with her husband's Colt Navy across her knees, and she watched the door. Outside, Cassian Roe unsaddled his bay and rubbed him down with a wisp of hay and stood for a long time looking at Naomi's cabin. The wind was rising now, pushing hard down out of the peaks, and he could feel the bite of the coming cold. In the country he had ridden across for the last 4 days, every homestead had smoke pouring from its chimney by supper time. Every homestead had firewood stacked to the eaves. Naomi Alder had a stack of firewood no bigger than a coffin. He could see the chimney from where he stood. A thin, almost invisible ribbon of smoke lifted from it, curling and vanishing at once. Not the fat gray column of a hard-burning fire. Something else. Something patient. He walked around the cabin in the last of the light. On the north side, where the wind came down Faulkner Ridge, the earth had been piled against the wall so thickly that grass grew on it. Sagebrush had rooted in it. It looked less like a wall than like part of the hill itself. On the west side, where a man might expect a woodshed, there was instead a low mound of packed dirt, and inside that mound, when he bent to look, he could see the mouth of a small door bound with strap iron. He tried the door. It was locked from within. He put his ear to the earth mound and listened, and he thought he could hear, very faintly, the sound of water dripping. He straightened. The wind moved the pines behind him and he smelled snow again. Closer now, an hour off, perhaps no more. "Woman," he said to himself, "what did you build here?" He walked back to the lean-to. The gray mule watched him come. She did not shy. She did not flatten her ears. She stood square on all 4 feet and watched him with the still, considering gaze of an animal who has already made up her mind about something and is only waiting to be proven right. He held out a hand. She did not sniff it. She did not step back. She only watched. He said, "Easy, old girl," and she blinked once slowly and turned her head toward the cabin as if to say, "That is where the trouble will come from, not from me." The snow began at full dark. It came the way snow comes at that altitude in that season, without preamble, in fat wet flakes that turned within an hour to hard dry pellets driven sideways by a wind that made the pines groan. Cassian Roe wrapped himself in his oilskin and his blanket, and lay in the lean-to and listened to the storm build. And by midnight he understood that he was not going anywhere in the morning. He understood something else, too. The lean-to was not warm. The wind cut through it. His bay stood shivering against the far wall, and Cassian could feel the cold working into his own bones through the oilskin and the blanket and the hay he had piled around himself. He had slept in worse. He had slept in worse many times. But he found himself thinking, again, of the thin ribbon of smoke from the cabin chimney, and of the small woodpile, and of the mound of earth on the west side with the iron-bound door. He thought about it for a long time. Then he got up and walked through the drifting snow to the cabin door and pounded on it with the flat of his hand. "Woman," he called, "your lean-to will kill my horse before morning. I mean you no harm. I give you my word." Silence. Then the door opened a hand's width. He saw the muzzle of the Colt Navy first, then Naomi Alder's face behind it. "You may bring your horse into the shed with the mule," she said. "You may sleep in the shed with your horse. You will not come into this cabin. The shed is warmer than the lean-to. The shed is warmer than the lean-to." He looked at her. He looked at the pistol. He said, "All right." She closed the door. He led the bay through the snow to the shed, which was the low structure attached to the earth mound on the west side. When he opened the door, warm air struck his face. It was not the warmth of a fire. There was no fire in the shed. It was the warmth of something else, something steady and low, a kind of held breath. The mule was already inside. She turned her head to look at him and blew softly through her nose. He stood in the doorway with the snow at his back and the strange warmth in front of him, and he thought, for the first time in a long time, that he might have ridden into something he did not understand. By morning the snow was 30 inches deep on the level, and higher than a man's chest in the drifts against the north wall. The wind had not slackened. It had strengthened. The valley was closed. The passes were closed. No rider was leaving that country for a week at least. And Cassian Roe, who had killed 2 men in Trinidad and a third in Cimarron and who was wanted in 3 territories, understood that his choices had narrowed to one. He stayed in the shed. He fed his bay from a small stack of hay that Naomi had left. He watered him from a wooden trough that had astonishingly not frozen. He watched the mule who watched him back, and around mid-morning, when the wind eased just enough that he could hear something besides itself, he heard Naomi Alder's voice on the other side of the shed's inner wall. She was talking to her children. He could not hear the words. He could hear the calm. He could hear the way a mother speaks to children who are frightened, but who trust her, and he found that he had to sit down on a bale of hay for a moment, because something in his chest had gone tight in a way he did not care to examine. He looked around the shed. He looked at the trough of unfrozen water. He looked at the ceiling of the shed, which was not planks, but packed earth supported by peeled cottonwood beams. He looked at the wall that separated the shed from whatever was beyond it, and he saw that the wall was not wood, it was stone. Rounded river stone, mortared with clay, the stones the size of a man's 2 fists, stacked from floor to ceiling in a wall 2 feet thick. He put his hand on the stone. It was warm, not hot, not the warmth of a stove, the warmth of a body, the warmth of a living thing that had stored the summer inside itself and was giving it back now, slowly, all winter long. He drew his hand away and stared at it. "Woman," he said aloud in the empty shed, "what did you build?" The mule from her corner flicked her one flopping ear. He did not go to the cabin door that morning. He waited until midday when the wind laid down for an hour and the sun came weakly through the driving cloud, and then he walked around the outside of the structure and looked at it with new eyes. He saw now what he had not seen the night before. The cabin was 2 buildings, not one. There was an outer wall of stacked mortared river stone, and inside that, separated by a gap of perhaps 18 inches, there was an inner wall of squared logs. Between the 2 walls the gap had been packed. He could not see with what, but he could. Dried grass, cattail down. Something that trapped air and would not burn easy, and would not rot fast. The roof was the same. A layer of split cedar shakes, then a layer of birch bark, then a foot of packed sod, and grass growing on top of the sod, so that from a distance from the ridge above, the cabin was invisible. From the ridge it would look like part of the hill. The chimney rose from the center of the cabin, not the wall. It rose through the sod roof in a stone column as thick as a man's chest. And when he put his ear near the outer stone wall, he could hear very faintly the sound of a small fire burning slowly on the inside. Slow fire, small fire. A fire that lived on twigs and split kindling and did not need cords of oak, because the walls were doing the work the fire could not do alone. He walked to the earth-covered mound on the west side. The iron-bound door was still locked. He could hear the drip of water again. He understood, suddenly, what it was. Somewhere under that mound spring water was seeping through stone, and the stone was catching it, and the earth above it was holding a temperature that would not let it freeze even when the air outside was 20 below. A root cellar, but not any root cellar he had ever seen. Something older. Something that had been built with knowledge, not habit. He walked back to the shed and sat down on the hay bale and stared at the wall of warm stone. The gray mule watched him. "All right, old girl," he said. "All right, talk to me." The mule did not talk to him, but she came over, unhurried, and stood in front of him, and lowered her head and touched her forehead against his chest, and stood there, breathing. He did not move for a long time. That night the temperature fell. Cassian Roe had been cold in his life. He had been cold in the winter of '64, sleeping in the frozen mud at Fort Pillow, and he had been cold in the winter of '70, when he had crossed the Bighorns on a stolen horse with a bullet in his shoulder. He knew what cold felt like at 10 below, at 15, at 20. He guessed this was 30. Inside the shed, wrapped in his blanket, with the bay on one side and the mule on the other and the warm stone wall at his back, he was not warm, but he did not freeze. He lay listening to the wind and to the low creak of the beams and to something else, a sound that took him a long time to place. It was the sound of the cabin breathing. There was a draft in the shed, very faint. It came from a small square hole cut low in the stone wall, near the floor, no bigger than a man's hand. Cold air trickled in through it, and at the top of the shed, in the peak of the roof under the sod, there was another hole, and warm air trickled out. He understood then that Naomi's cabin was breathing him. It was taking cold air from outside, warming it against the stone, drawing it up along the walls, letting it rise and vent, and the whole slow cycle was moving heat through the structure, the way blood moves through a body. The stone wall was warm because the fire had been warming it, gently, for days. Once warm, it would stay warm for a long time. The hay in the wall gap kept the heat from escaping. The earth on the north side kept the wind from stripping it. The sod on the roof kept it from lifting away into the sky. He had ridden through this country for years, and he had seen 1,000 homesteads. He had seen log cabins and dugouts and soddies. He had never seen anything like this. He had never seen anyone build a house that thought, on the 3rd day of the storm, the fever came for Ephraim. Cassian did not know at first. He knew only that at some point in the small hours of the morning the cabin door opened, and Naomi Alder came out into the storm with a lantern and a shawl and made her way to the shed. She knocked once. He opened the door. She looked at him. Her face was drawn thin. "My boy is burning up," she said. "I need something from the cellar, and I cannot carry a lantern and the key and the child at the same time. Will you come?" He looked at her for a moment, and he saw that she had come to him because she had no one else to come to, and that this cost her something he could not measure. He picked up his coat. "I will come." She led him through the drifts to the earth mound. She unlocked the door. Warm air came out of it, and the smell of damp earth and stored apples and something else, something faintly medicinal. She held the lantern, and he ducked and followed her inside. The cellar was larger than he had guessed. It was dug back into the ridge itself, perhaps 12 feet deep, lined with more of the mortared river stone. Shelves along the walls held crocks of lard and bags of dried beans and strings of onions and rows of clay jars sealed with wax. On the floor, in wooden crates packed with dry sand, sat carrots and turnips and potatoes and a whole crop's worth of apples, the fruit still red, the skin still firm, though he was standing in a storm 3 months past harvest. But it was the ceiling that stopped him. The ceiling was hung with drying herbs, yarrow, mint, sage, wild bergamot, elderflower, willow bark, osha root. He knew some of these. He had known a Cheyenne woman once who had used osha for a wound in his side. Naomi took a bundle of willow bark and a smaller bundle of what he thought was elderflower, and she pulled down a stoneware jar with a wax seal and held it under her arm. "Come," she said. Quickly, they went back out into the storm. She locked the cellar door behind her. In the cabin doorway she paused and looked at him and said, without meeting his eyes, "You may sit by the fire. Only until the boy is easier. Then you go back." He said, "Yes, Mum." He went in. The cabin was warm. Not stove hot, not stuffy, but warm the way a body is warm. There was a small iron stove in the center, its door open, a modest fire of split pine burning inside. A copper kettle sat on top. The floor was packed earth covered with elk hide. Along the south wall, above the raised sleeping platform, the 3 windows glowed faintly with the pale stormlight, and along the north wall, tucked into the earth-backed slope, was a bench built of stone. A stone bench, wide and low, and beneath it, the fire's flue passed through a stone channel before rising to the chimney. The bench was warm. He understood at once, without having to be told. The smoke from the fire did not go straight up. It ran sideways through a stone channel under the bench, giving up its heat to the stone, before finally rising and leaving through the chimney. The stone held the heat and gave it back for hours after the fire had gone out. In the coldest part of the night, when a normal fire would have died and a normal cabin gone cold, the stone bench would still be warm enough to sleep on. His grandmother had told him long ago that in the old country in the mountains where her people came from, they had built such things. She had called it by a word he could no longer remember. He had thought it was a fairy tale. He looked at Naomi Alder's cabin and he understood, finally and all at once, that everything he had thought was strange about it was one single idea, patiently applied. The earth wall on the north held the cold outside. The stone bench inside held the fire's heat and released it slowly. The double wall with the packed hay kept the heat from leaving. The sod roof kept the wind from stealing it. The ventilation holes brought in only as much cold air as the fire needed to breathe. The root cellar in the ridge kept food from freezing because the earth itself held the summer. The whole cabin was a machine for keeping warmth. Not making it, keeping it. It burned in one day what a normal cabin burned in 3, and it stayed warm on nights that would have killed a family in a plank house half a mile down the valley. He sat by the stove and he watched Naomi Alder crush willow bark in a wooden bowl and pour hot water over it and add a spoonful of dark honey from the sealed jar and hold the cup to her son's mouth. And he did not say anything at all, because he did not have any words that would have been worth the saying. The boy's fever broke a little before dawn. Naomi had sat by the platform through the whole night, wetting his forehead with a cloth dipped in melted snow, sponging his throat, humming a low song that Cassian did not know, but that sounded like something a great-grandmother might have sung. The 2 girls had slept curled against each other at the foot of the platform. Cassian had sat by the stove and fed it, small stick by small stick, because Naomi had told him to feed it that way. "Do not build it up," she had said, "feed it slow. The stones do the rest." Around 4 in the morning she had looked at him across the room and said quietly, "You are Cassian Roe." He had not moved. "How did you know?" "There was a paper in Alamosa in September. My neighbor showed it to me. I remembered the face." He watched her. She was watching her son. "You brought me into your cabin knowing who I was." I brought you into my cabin because my son was dying and I could not carry him and the lantern and the key. I would have brought the devil in for the same reason. And now," she looked up. In the firelight her face was tired and calm, and there was no fear in it, only a great weariness. "Now," she said, "I am going to feed my children breakfast when the sun comes up, and you are going to decide what kind of man you want to be for the rest of your life." He did not answer. She said, "There is a paper on you for $400. My mule is not worth $400. She is not worth 40. She is old and she is slow, and she will not last another 2 winters. If you had wanted a horse, you should have taken your own back into the storm and ridden south. You did not ride south. You came to my door because you were cold and you were tired, and because a part of you already knew that you were done." He stared at her. "You do not know me," he said. "I know you slept in the shed for 3 nights and did not come to this door except when I opened it. I know you carried a lantern for a woman who put a pistol on you 2 nights ago. I know that Mule, who has kicked 3 men in her life, let you stand beside her in the dark. Fen does not let bad men stand beside her. She never has." He looked away. Ephraim, on the platform, stirred and murmured something in his sleep. And Naomi turned to him at once and laid her hand on his forehead. And Cassian saw her shoulders drop a 1/4 inch as she felt the coolness there, and he understood that she had been holding that 1/4 inch of tension since the middle of the night. He got up and went to the stove and put in another small stick. The storm broke on the 5th day. The sun came up over the eastern peaks into a sky the pale hard blue of a robin's egg, and the whole valley lay under 6 feet of snow, and nothing moved in it except a single column of wood smoke rising thin and slow from Naomi Alder's chimney. Cassian saddled his bay. He led him out of the shed into the yard. He stood a long time with one hand on the mule's neck. Fen turned her head and looked at him with her long patient eye. Naomi came out of the cabin with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She held it out to him. It was heavy. He looked inside. Cornbread, salt pork, a twist of the willow bark, a small clay pot sealed with wax that he understood without asking was the dark honey. "You are not taking the mule," she said. "No. You are not taking anything else either." "No." He stood in the yard with the bundle in his hands, and he could not think of a thing to say that would not sound like a lie or a coward's speech. So he said the only true thing he had. "I have never seen a house like yours." She almost smiled. It was the first time. It was a small, tired smile that touched her eyes only at the corners. "My husband's people came from the mountains east of the Volga," she said. "His mother taught me to build a stove that runs through a bench. Peter Standing Bear taught me to bank the north wall with earth and to put the cellar in the ridge. My father taught me to double the walls and pack them with hay. I did not invent any of it. I only listened to old people while they were still alive to talk." He looked at the cabin. He looked at the mound of the cellar. He looked at the shed with the warm stone wall. "There are men," he said slowly, "who would ride 100 miles to burn a house like this, because they did not understand it. I know. There are men who would ride 100 miles to protect it because they finally did." She did not answer. He swung up onto the bay. He looked down at her from the saddle. He said, "There is a marshal in Del Norte named Hollis. He is a hard man, but he is a fair one. If I ride to him now, I will hang. If I ride to him in the spring and turn myself in willing, and if I bring back what I took from the bank in Cimarron, I will do 15 years in the territorial and I will come out an old man. Either way, I am done with the country I have been riding in." She looked up at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," he said, "somebody built a house that keeps children alive. Through a storm that would have killed my horse, and it was a woman standing alone with 3 little ones. And if I ride out of here and pretend I never saw it, I will not be able to sleep in any house for the rest of my life." He touched the brim of his hat. He turned the bay. Fen, in the yard, lifted her head and watched him ride away, and her one flopping ear tilted forward, thinking. He came back in April. The snow was off the low ground by then. The passes were open. The cottonwoods along the creek were showing the first green fuzz, and the meadowlarks were back on the fence posts. Naomi was in the garden, turning the earth with a spade when she heard hooves on the wagon trace, and she looked up, and she saw a wagon coming, and behind it, tied to the tailgate, was a good young mule. The wagon was driven by a marshal in a black coat. Beside him sat Cassian Roe with his wrists chained to the seat rail. He looked thinner than she remembered. He looked older. He looked like a man who had been sleeping properly for the first time in a long time. The marshal reined in at the yard. He looked at Naomi and he looked at the cabin, and he touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Alder." Marshal. Man in the seat here says he owes you a mule. Says the one you got is too old to break sod this spring and he'd like to leave you a better one. He paused. Says he'd also like to leave you this. He held up a canvas bag. It clinked. Says it's the money from Samaran. Says he'd like you to send it back to the bank there with your next mail rider, if you would, and if there's a reward from the bank for its return, you're to keep it. Says he asked the judge, and the judge allowed it. Naomi stood in her garden with the spade in her hand. She looked at Cassian. He looked back at her from the wagon seat, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said in silence for 5 days in a shed that smelled of hay and warm stone. She walked across the yard. She took the bag from the marshal. She untied the young mule from the tailgate and led him to the fence and turned him in with Fen. The two mules stood nose to nose for a moment, and old Fen laid her floppy ear back and looked the young one over, and then she blew softly, once, and turned away, and began to graze. Naomi came back to the wagon. She looked at Cassian. "How long?" she said. 15 years, Mom. You will not be a young man when you come out." "No, Mom. When you come out," she said, "if I am still on this ground, there will be a plate at my table. That is not a promise of anything more than a plate, but it will be there." His eyes went wet and he looked away quickly, because he was a man who had not permitted himself to cry in front of anyone since he was 7 years old, and he did not intend to begin now in front of a federal marshal. "Thank you, Mom," he said. The marshal clucked to the team. The wagon moved on. Naomi stood in the yard with the canvas bag in one hand and the spade in the other, and she watched them go until they were a small dark shape at the far end of the trace, and then smaller, and then gone. The following winter was worse than the one before. The old men in Alamosa said it was the worst since '68. The snow came in the last week of October, and it did not truly leave until the last week of April. 3 homesteads in the valley were lost. A family named Corbin, 2 miles down the creek from Naomi, froze in their beds in January when their chimney caught and burned through and the roof came in. A rancher named Delacroix lost 40 head of cattle in a single drift. The stage from Del Norte did not run for 11 weeks. Naomi Alder's cabin burned 3/4 of a cord of pine that winter. That was all. 3/4 of a cord, when her nearest neighbor burned 6. Her root cellar carried her family through the spring with apples still firm, and potatoes still sound, and a full crock of lard she had not yet touched. Her stone bench held its heat from the evening fire until the sun came through the south windows in the morning. Her double walls, banked with earth on the north and packed with hay in the gap, did not sweat, did not rot, did not let the wind through. When the county surveyor came through in May mapping claims for the new road, he stopped his horse in her yard and stared at her cabin for a long time. He was an educated man from Philadelphia. He had studied engineering at a school back east. He got down from his horse and walked around the structure the way Cassian Roe had walked around it. And when he came back, he took off his hat and asked her, with real humility, if she would explain to him what he was looking at. She made him a cup of willow bark tea with dark honey, and she sat him at her table and she told him. She told him that heat wants to leave a house, and that a house is nothing but the fight to keep it. She told him that stone remembers warmth, and that earth remembers the season, and that hay in a wall gap remembers nothing and lets nothing through. She told him that a chimney that runs sideways through a bench robs the smoke of its warmth before it escapes to the sky, and that a cellar dug into the ridge steals the summer and keeps it against the winter, and that a sod roof is not a poor man's roof, it is a wise man's roof, because grass on a roof lifts nothing to the wind. She told him that the mule Fen was 14 years old and had once let a wanted man stand beside her in the dark because the man's heart was not yet closed, and that a good mule knows a heart the way a good house knows a season. The surveyor wrote it all down in a small leather book. He wrote it down carefully because he understood, as Cassian Roe had understood in the shed, that he was looking at a kind of knowledge that was already passing out of the world, that had been carried west in the heads of old people from a dozen countries, and that would be lost, forever and entirely, the moment those old people died. He asked her, at the door, whether she had a name for the way her cabin was built. She thought for a moment. "My husband's mother called the stove a warm bench," she said. "Peter Standing Bear called the cellar the sleeping summer. My father called the double wall the coat with 2 skins. I do not think it has one name. I think it is many old names put together on one piece of ground." The surveyor nodded. He wrote that down too. Then he mounted his horse and rode out of the yard, and Naomi Alder went back into her cabin, where her 3 children were bent over their slates by the light of the south windows. And she closed the door behind her, and the wind came down out of the peaks and moved across the ridge, and around the earth-banked wall and over the sod roof, and away down the valley, and it did not find a single seam to enter by. 15 years is a long time on a ridge in the San Luis Valley. In 15 years the cottonwoods along the creek grew tall enough to shade the whole west side of the yard. In 15 years Sable Alder married a schoolteacher from Saguache and moved to a house of her own, and Ren Alder became a nurse in Denver, and Ephraim Alder, who had almost died of a fever in his 5th winter, grew into a tall, quiet young man with his father's steady eyes, who took over the running of the homestead and enlarged the cellar, and built a second stone bench along the east wall for his mother, because her hip had begun to trouble her in the cold. The mule fen died in her 17th year. She died in the pasture on a summer morning, standing in the sun, with her floppy ear tilted forward as if she were thinking about something. Ephraim buried her at the top of the ridge where she could see the valley, and Naomi stood beside the grave for a long time and said nothing, because there are some things a mule does that you do not have the words for even 15 years later. The young mule that had been left in the wagon that April day was named Grace. She was a good mule. She was not fen. Nobody was fen. In the spring of that 15th year, on a warm afternoon in late May, a wagon came up the trace. It was driven by an old man with white hair and a stiff back. He was thin. He was very thin. He wore a plain gray coat and a plain gray hat, and he drove slowly because his hands were not what they had been. Naomi Alder was on the porch. She had built a porch on the south side 10 years back because Ephraim had said his mother needed a place to sit in the sun. She was 61 years old. Her hair was gray. Her eyes had not changed. The wagon stopped in the yard. The old man got down slowly, one hand on the wheel to steady himself. He stood for a moment looking at the cabin, at the earth banked against the north wall, at the sod roof where the spring grass was coming in green, at the mound of the cellar where a clump of wild iris had rooted and was in bloom. He walked to the porch. He took off his hat. He said, "Mom." Naomi looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, then she stood up slowly and she said, "There is a plate at the table, as I said there would be." Cassian Roe, who was 63 years old and who had done 15 years and 4 months in the territorial and had come out an old man exactly as he had said he would, stood in her yard with his hat in his hands, and he did not say anything because he was a man who had learned, over 15 winters in a stone room without a bench and without a hay-packed wall and without a sod roof, that some things are said better by simply being present for them. He sat at her table. She fed him cornbread and salt pork and dried apples from the cellar and a cup of willow bark tea with dark honey. Ephraim came in from the field and shook his hand without a word, because Naomi had told her children everything, long ago, in the way that a mother tells her children the truth, so that they will not have to learn it later from strangers. After supper, Cassian walked out into the yard. The evening was cool. The sun was going down behind the peaks. He walked around the cabin the way he had walked around it 15 years and 1 winter before, and he saw that it was the same, and that it was different, because now he understood every wall and every stone and every handful of packed hay for what it was. He stopped at the shed. He put his hand on the stone wall inside. It was warm. The evening fire had been going for perhaps an hour. The stones were already giving back their patient-held heat. He stood with his hand on the wall a long time, and he did not know he was weeping until Naomi came out and stood beside him, and put her hand very lightly on his sleeve. "I did not think," he said, "that anything I saw in this world was going to outlast me, but this house will." "Yes," she said, "this house will, and the way of building it. If I can teach it to enough people, yes." He nodded. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I would like to help you teach it, for whatever time I have left, if you will let me." She looked at him. "Cassian Roe," she said, "there is more work on this ridge than 1 old woman and 1 grown son can do. You may sleep in the shed until you build yourself a small room of your own onto the east side. I would suggest," she said, and there was the ghost of a smile at the corners of her eyes, "that you build it with a double wall packed with hay, and a stone bench along the north side, and a sod roof, and a small square window of wagon grease paper facing south." "Yes, Mom," he said, "I believe I will." They stood a while longer in the yard. Above them the first stars came out over the peaks. Behind them the cabin breathed its slow warm breath into the coming night, taking in the cold air low, letting the warm air rise, moving heat through its stone bones the way a body moves blood. And it would keep breathing that way through this night and the next, and every night that followed, for as long as anyone tended its small, careful fire. And somewhere on the ridge above them, in a grave that had grown over long ago with wild grass and yarrow and the small blue mountain aster, the old mule fen lay with her long, patient bones pointed east toward the sun. And it was as it should have been, because in the end, the story had not been about the outlaw or the widow, or even the children who slept warm through the worst winter the valley had ever known. It had been about the house, and about the old people in a dozen countries and a dozen tongues, who had known once how to build such a house, and who had almost taken that knowing with them into the ground, and who had not in the end, because a tired woman on a ridge in Colorado had listened to them while there was still time. That, and nothing else, was what the mule had known when she stood in the dark with an outlaw's hand on her neck, and did not shy. That, in the end, was what brought him back.